I don't know if I should wait for a couple more minutes just to see if, honestly, can't even see if anyone's listening to this. So maybe we'll just go ahead. Okay, we're live. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Robin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kylie Mohr. I'm a freelance writer and a correspondent for High Country News. I often write about wildfire, among other topics. And today we are going to be talking about my recent investigation for High Country News, which just published yesterday. For those of you who haven't read it yet, it's about the working conditions of wildland fire dispatchers, who are a critical but often overlooked part of fighting fires. You can read it at hcn.org, or if you're a subscriber, it might already be in your mailbox. Just a little bit of background before we jump into it. Wildland fire dispatchers are a crucial link in the fast-moving series of decisions that are needed to start fighting a fire. So when a fire sparks, they're the ones who are responsible for figuring out, okay, who's nearby to fight it and sending resources where they need to go as quickly as possible. Firefighters have told me that a good dispatcher is really make or break if you want to keep fires small. And when dispatching resources are spread thin, it can hinder everything from implementing and monitoring prescribed burns to suppressing an active fire. So today I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Robin Verble, who was a source for this story and knows a lot about what dispatchers are going through. Dr. Verble is an associate professor and director of the environmental science program at Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla, Missouri. She studies wildland firefighter safety and environmental health. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Dr. Verble, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on when it comes to dispatcher experiences and well-being?
So my research team at the beginning of 2023 put together a large-scale survey looking at the national federal wildland fire dispatch population. So our survey was really broad-reaching, looked at occupational health and environmental health at the broadest scale, everything from safety to job hazards to mental health, workload, and then how those were affecting things like home life, work-life balance, physical health, mental health, and we got about a quarter of the national population to respond. So that's a really great number when you're working in survey data.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, what a representative sample. You must have been thrilled to get that many responses.
Absolutely.
What prompted you? I know we talked about this when I first interviewed you for the story, but how did you get interested in what was going on with dispatchers? What made you want to do this nationwide, really comprehensive survey?
So historically, my work's been in wildland fire ecology. And working in wildland fire ecology, you end up working with a lot of wildland firefighters because they tend to be the people who are working on either suppressing or setting the fires that are in your research plots. So I've always had a really deep connection with wildland firefighters. I ended up marrying one. My first faculty position was as assistant professor of wildland fire ecology at Texas Tech University, where I did a lot of wildland firefighter training. And so as a lot of these national issues coming around pay and benefits and job title and job status were emerging, I started getting a lot more conversations started with those wildland firefighters that I've been working with. But it was actually one of my former students, Rachel Granberg, who reached out. She's now a wildland firefighter and said, hey, I've got these problems. I've got this data. Let's start exploring this in greater detail. And so at her urging, we just dove in, and I really shifted some of my research gears to start thinking about some of these questions related to environmental health and wildland firefighters, which is a really understudied area at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I love that origin story, and I didn't realize that you had so many personal connections to, wildland firefighters. That's great. And I love how, I think that's really interesting that you started with a background in ecology and then you started interacting with kind of the people side of fire more and more. So I think it's great that you dovetailed those together and realized the synergies there, because I think sometimes, it can be easy to silo those two elements. But as we know, if you don't have healthy firefighters or dispatchers doing their jobs, then everything else can kind of fall by the wayside.
Yeah. And the links between people and fire have been long-standing. When you think about hundreds of years now, people have been the ones really lighting fires and often shaping the fire landscapes we're working on.
Right. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about, you had this massive survey, you got a ton of responses. What were some of your main findings? What would you want to highlight from that?
Yeah, so we'd done a survey the year before looking at operational wildland firefighters, so the folks that are out there in the smoke and the heat. And so when we moved into the dispatch room, we thought we'd see some of the same trends. We saw issues with pay, we saw issues with retention. But what we found when we started looking at wildland fire dispatchers was a really unsettling series of trends where we saw that occupational stressors were pretty high. So things like traumatic exposure, they work radios a lot of times. So while they might not be on the fire line, they're still the ones dispatching the resources to injuries and mortalities. And most of them, over half and oftentimes over 3/4, have experienced these really intense traumatic exposures where they're dispatching to a mortality. They have really long, heavy workloads. So long work days, long work shifts when you think about it over the season. And they're understaffed about at a critical mass at this point. And their working conditions tend to be pretty unhealthy and unsafe. Smaller things like the ergonomics maybe of the situation, but things like parking lot lighting or who they're being exposed to in the dispatch room. And all that was translating into these really unhealthy and unsustainable work-life balance situations, difficulty maintaining relationships outside of work, unhealthy mental health, and unhealthy physical health.
Yeah, gosh, I'm so happy that you did such a comprehensive look because I think it can be, this is something that I heard in my reporting and that's mentioned in the story, which is just that dispatchers feel overlooked. Like there's luckily, thankfully, and warranted, there's so much more attention on, the firefighters on the line and, are they breathing in smoke? What are their working conditions like? And that's great. But then you also have these people who are in dispatch centers who, have a really unique encounter with fire. I think, like you just said, touching so many different points of trauma can be huge and something that, if you're on a fire, you're just involved with what's going on in that fire. But a dispatcher might be coordinating things from, multiple fires at once every single day.
Yeah, and to borrow a term from ecology, they're kind of the keystone species of the fire operation. They everything flows through dispatch. If you're trying to communicate between two branches or divisions of the fire, you have dispatch helping facilitate that communication. Resource ordering is coming through, and so if your dispatch center is not healthy, if your dispatch center isn't functioning optimally, that's really going to cascade out into all parts of the fire operation.
I love the keystone species. That's great. I might have to use that sometime. You talked a little bit about this already, but what really stood out to me when I was looking at the results of your work for this piece was the really high rates of signs of mental health challenges, like signs of depression, PTSD, signs of suicidal ideation, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about how wildland firefighter dispatchers compare to the general population when it comes to some of those stats?
Yeah. So this was probably the hardest part of our work to really look at and see the data. As we collected our survey data, I probably spent more time obsessing about this little bit and checking these numbers as numbers came in, just because I didn't like seeing these trends in the slightest. About 10% of our wildland fire dispatchers had high levels of suicidal ideation. So this is the kind of suicidal ideation that is considered really critical. It's not where we rank this on low, moderate, and high in a lot of these categorical scales. So low might be, I've considered this, I've thought about this, but high levels of suicidal ideation is active planning.
Okay.
So 10% of our population responded that they have high levels of suicidal ideation. In our general public population, that's less than 1%. And so this is a really startling number. This is the kind of number that you see in returning military populations. This is not a number that you find really outside of many really, really critical high stress situations. So that number is shocking and concerning. When we saw things like PTSD, about a third of our dispatchers exhibited the characteristics of PTSD. The general population's at about 5%. One of the interesting things with our dispatch population, we used a screener again, so asking about symptoms, and we get that 1/3 using that screener. When we ask them, have they been treated for? Do they, or do they self-identify as having PTSD? Those numbers dropped. So suggesting that maybe they're not self-identifying or they're not self-admitting that these conditions are what they are for themselves. And then looking at anxiety and depression, over half of our dispatchers and pushing upwards of 65% had anxiety and or depression, and that's about a fifth of the US population. So really high numbers of mental health concerns relative to the US population.
Yeah, so much higher than your average person, if there is such a thing. I remember when we were talking for the story, you said that you double checked those numbers over and over again because you thought this can't be right. It can't be this high. Ugh, gosh. Well, I'm glad that your research is bringing this to light. Yeah, identification, I feel like, is the first step of solving some of these things. And, just to move on a little bit from that, Region 6 of the Forest Service, which is in the Pacific Northwest, they did a survey actually kind of trying to get at some of these same questions last year into dispatcher health and well-being. And those survey results, they hadn't been made public yet until my story, thanks to some sources and some leaked documents. But those survey results, they've been presented internally to Forest Service leadership. And among other things, it found that wildland fire dispatchers face challenges that not only compromise their own health and safety, like you were just talking about, but also that of their firefighters and fellow coworkers out on the line. And I was just wondering, like, how does that finding or how does that survey square with your work?
So yeah, those data square up with what we're seeing really well. I was really surprised when I found out about that survey. We hear a lot from our wildland firefighters and our dispatchers about survey fatigue. They're like, oh gosh, another survey. And so your survey response rate drops a lot when you get surveys that aren't being effectively translated outward. So when you do a survey and you don't get any results or you don't even hear anything about it as a respondent, you can really feel demoralized. And when the next survey comes along, less likely to do it. So, not sharing those results out and not really making them public was a really frustrating thing for me to hear.
Yeah, that's interesting. From like a survey design perspective, I'm sure we've all taken surveys, whether it be through work or a group that you're part of or anything like that. And yeah, you do kind of want to know, like, how do my answers square up and what are the overall findings of this? It kind of helps you put your own experience into context.
Yeah, especially with this population, which, as you mentioned in your own work, and we heard time and time again, they really feel undervalued. They really feel underrepresented. They don't feel seen in their work, and a lot of that's coming through in how some of our federal policies are being crafted. And so I think that was really critical that that information get out there as quick as possible. But yeah, from what your reporting found, we're seeing trends that while we didn't examine that next step, looking at how that affects the fire line, you can hypothesize from our work pretty neatly that the conditions we're seeing would have similar results. When you have a population that's sleep deprived, when you have a population with high levels of mental health concerns, that's overworked, that's not functioning at their optimum, that's going to translate toward possibly higher error rates, possibly less good judgment, higher risk taking, and that compromises safety on the fire line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great point, and that's kind of the unknown right now. All signs point to that, but can changes be made in time so that there aren't any major errors or anything like that. I think that's a really nice segue too. I want to talk a little bit about potential solutions and not just be harping on everything that's wrong. What did in your survey? What did dispatchers tell you could be improved? What is going to maybe try to keep them in this role, doing a good job, keeping people safe, and also being, safer, happier versions of themselves at the same time?
So I always think that this is such an interesting result to me. We asked them about a series of different things, like, would this help retain you in the field? And it was everything from pay to retirement benefits to more scheduling flexibility, and pretty much everything we asked them, they said, yeah, that'd help. Anything would help. That'd be great. But the thing that got the highest response was recognition for the work they're doing. which I thought was, I mean, and it was just marginally higher than pay, right? Pay is probably still the best one, but yeah, recognition was actually right there at the top. So I think having a workplace that values, sees, understands, and appreciates the work that's being done there, and that may come through title, being titled correctly as a wildland firefighter, a member of that wildland firefighting community. That may be through making sure the pay and the benefits reflect the level of risk and exposure that is happening in that dispatch room. I think those are things that can be done immediately and quickly and easily. Some of the other things are going to be longer term solutions. Things like mental health don't get fixed overnight, and there's a trade-off. People want to work a lot because right now, with pay being low, work means the pay to support your family and your life. So we need to make sure we're finding ways to make it financially okay to take that time off to get the mental health access. So maybe making paid mental health leave or paid therapy time part of the work. Right now, we give an hour a day of PT, physical training time, for our wildland firefighters. You could possibly add in an hour of therapy time. That would be a nice option. But I think making sure that the effort's getting made in the short term and being obvious and present and consistent is going to be the priority.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, all those factors are so intertwined, right? Like sometimes having higher pay or more benefits does make you feel more valued because you feel like your work is being seen, it's being paid appropriately. But some of those kind of larger cultural systemic shifts, you could raise the pay overnight if that was a possibility, which it isn't. As you've probably seen, it's firefighter pay has really been languishing in Congress recently. And I don't think it's been not solved. It's, the government didn't shut down, but I think that just kicked the firefighter pay can down the road to mid-November, early November.
And at the time of our survey, dispatchers weren't known for sure that they were going to be included as part of wildland firefighters. We had that was a situation that wasn't resolved when the firefighter pay transition came. The initial bump in benefits, dispatchers weren't included.
Yeah, okay, I remember hearing that. It's hard to feel valued if you feel like you're totally being left out. And for people who might not know, the majority of dispatchers have at least 90 days of firefighting operational, experience on the line. So that qualifies them sometimes for fitting into that category. Yeah, gosh, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm glad that there's so many solutions out there. You just listed numerous ones that would be great. I guess now it's just a question of doing the work to, get them going and get changes starting to happen.
Yeah, I think getting action in Congress that makes things permanent is probably the most crucial thing right now. With everything being so precarious and in the balance, firefighters still aren't even clear come November if their pay is going to be dropping 25-30%. And so right now it's a really precarious situation. Dispatchers also know that there's going to be a potentially high attrition rate. People are going to be leaving if things don't change, and that puts a lot more stress on them. Hiring is difficult. Finding qualified people is difficult. So that just cascades things down even further.
Right. And of course, this is all happening too as wildfires are becoming more frequent, more severe, more destructive. Like we need a strong firefighting apparatus now more than ever, you could argue. So, getting those people, getting the foundations squared away, I think feels really important from what I've been.
Absolutely. In terms of national priorities, should be right up there with national defense, national homeland level security. When you're thinking about people's homes, property, and the ability to sustain our infrastructure, this is going to be now and into the future a major issue.
That's such a great point. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to bring up, or anything that we didn't get a chance to talk about the first time around?
I will say I always like to try to end on a positive note. I always ask my dispatchers why they do the work, and I never get a majority negative answers there. I always hear really great things. They love their jobs. They want to be in this field. They're passionate about their work. They want to find ways to continue to do this work. They just have to have it make sense for living and be a livable situation for them. So I never want them to come across as anything other than a population that's really trying and doing their absolute best. They've been incredibly perseverant through this.
Yeah, definitely. I think that squares with the dispatchers that I spoke with as well. Some of whom, of course, if you read the story, you'll see that there were some levels of anonymity, and not everyone, understandably, feels comfortable speaking to the media with their name attached, especially on controversial issues. But I heard the same thing time and time again, like really, really believing in their job, wanting to help. It seemed like there was a really strong kind of, not community service mindset, but definitely helping, feeling good that they were helping, playing this really meaningful role, and, making a difference at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for listening, everyone. You can find the story that we've been talking about and many more at the High Country News website, which is www.hcn.org. And you can follow HCN on Twitter, now called X, at High Country News. You can also find me there. My handle is at That's More Like It, Mohr, which is my last name. Dr. Verble, if folks want to find out more about your work or keep tabs with what you're doing, how can they do that?
So we have a website. It's the wildlandfiresurvey.com. And I'm on Twitter at r_Verble as well.
Okay, perfect. I know I'll be watching to see what other, do you have any other surveys in the works or any studies kind of in this realm that you'll have some results coming out on at any time soon?
So we have an ongoing study that will be wrapping up at the end of 2024, looking at sleep and workload and error rates in wildland fire dispatchers. So measuring how workload and sleep are interacting, and then how that could translate into differences in error rates. And we're looking forward to repeating our survey of both operational folks and dispatchers in another year or so, once hopefully things have settled down with this, the Wildland Fire Pay Act, and we can see if there's been some changes after that's been implemented.
Oh, interesting. Well, you can definitely expect to be hearing from me, especially on the sleep and error rates. That sounds fascinating. So stay tuned, everyone. There might be another story in the works. Thanks again so much for joining me, Dr. Verble, and thanks everyone for watching. Have a great day.